Do you tend to take things personally? Maybe you get defensive when your spouse gives you some feedback, or you assume that your coworkers don't like you when they criticize your work, or maybe you feel overly responsible for other people's bad moods and emotions. No matter what form it takes, taking things personally can wreak havoc on your emotional life and your relationships. But there is good news. It is absolutely something you can change about yourself with a little bit of practice and some patience. Today, I'm going to share 5 of the best ways I have found to stop taking things so personally and develop a more balanced and resilient sense of self. Number 1, practice criticizing your own behavior. Now, I know this one sounds a little bit counterintuitive, but hear me out. A core problem with taking things personally is overextending criticism of your behavior to criticism of yourself. For example, let's say your boss gives you some really tough criticism about a report you had to file recently, and you assume that she doesn't respect you or thinks you're incompetent. In this case, you're extending her critique of your performance to a critique of your character. Or let's say your spouse is visibly upset with you and not as cheerful as usual. You assume it's because they're mad at you. In this case, you're assuming that they're thinking negatively about you as a person rather than upset with some specific aspect of your behavior. Not to mention, of course, the possibility that maybe them being upset has nothing to do with you. If you want to stop taking things so personally, you need to get better at distinguishing behavioral criticism from character criticism. And a good way to start practicing this is to get in the habit of criticizing your own behavior without criticizing your character. For example, let's say you suddenly remember that you forgot to send a really important email earlier in the day. Now, instead of criticizing yourself, God, why am I such an idiot? I can't believe I forgot to send that email. Replace that more general criticism of your character with a more narrow and focused criticism of your behavior. So you might say, it's not great that I forgot to send that email. I need to work on a better system for responding to email. Some of them don't fall through the cracks like this. Or suppose your partner is giving you some really tough feedback about your habit of leaving stuff laying around all over the house. Instead of personalizing their criticism, she thinks I'm a slob, try to replace that self-criticism with a criticism that's more focused on your actual behavior. She's right. Leaving stuff around the house is a bad habit, and I need to work on not doing that so much anymore. So if you have struggled with taking things personally for a long time, it's very natural that we tend to see all criticism as bad, but it's not. Given and received well, criticism is actually a wonderful thing because it promotes growth and positive change. And if you want to get better at receiving it well and not taking things so personally all the time, practice criticizing yourself well, keeping it narrow and specific and focused on your actions, not your character. And if you do this regularly, you'll have a much easier time seeing other people's criticisms as feedback on your behavior, not critiques of your character or self-worth. Number 2, reframe criticism as feedback. So some common pushback I get when I suggest not interpreting criticism of behavior as criticism of character goes something like this. But what if they really do just think I'm dumb or an idiot? Or what if they really just don't like me as a person? First thing is, not taking things personally, it doesn't mean assuming that everybody loves you and thinks you're the best. That's just as irrational as thinking that everyone hates you and thinks you're the worst. Not taking things personally means that you don't assume that people are thinking badly of you as a person when there's no evidence for that. Still, there probably are situations and relationships where other people do think badly of you, your character, your personality, even your very core self. And even if that is the case, you can still stop yourself from ruminating on how much they dislike you by reframing those criticisms and judgments as feedback. Let me give you some examples of what that looks like. Let's say you are at a performance review at work, and you're pretty sure that your manager just really doesn't like you. And when he's criticizing aspects of your job and your performance, the evidence, real evidence, actually suggests that he's also pretty critical of you as a person. It's not just in your head. Other people think the same thing. There's plenty of evidence for it. Now that's a tough situation. And as a rule, you should probably try to avoid or get out of relationships where other people actively think bad of you as a person. Still, you are in this situation, and frankly, there's not much you can do about it right now anyway. So what do? Well, you could dwell on and ruminate over and stew on the fact that your manager doesn't like you as a person and how unfair and mean that is. But honestly, however true that may or may not be, it's unlikely to generate anything helpful or positive, and it will almost certainly cause you a lot of emotional pain. Alternatively, you could reframe their criticism as feedback. So you might say something to yourself like, you know what? I know he doesn't like me, but his criticism of my work, it does have some validity to it. I really should be more prompt turning things in. I'm going to work on that. Doing this, reframing criticism as feedback, it's really powerful for two important reasons. The first is, as I alluded to before, it short circuits unhelpful mental habits like rumination and worry. Just because something's true doesn't mean it's helpful. But a lot of people, they rationalize unhelpful mental habits like worry and rumination because they are or might be true. Your manager, they might actually despise you. But however true that is, I don't think dwelling on it is doing you any good. And in fact, it's probably harming you. So when you reframe that criticism as feedback, when you look for something constructive within it, you short circuit all of that unhelpful mental mechanics like rumination and worry that just make you feel worse. The second reason, though, there's another reason this is really important. When you reframe criticism as feedback, when you look for a growth opportunity within it, it's empowering and fosters agency. See, when you deliberately choose to focus on what's helpful and constructive instead of getting lost in negativity, you're teaching your brain a really powerful lesson, which is that in the face of negativity, I choose how I want to live my life. I'm not the victim of my circumstances. I decide how I want to respond to bad things. And if you do this repeatedly, and it starts to become a core belief that you are the author and the hero of your life, not some victim or, shallow side character. This belief becomes incredibly empowering and confidence promoting. Of course, in the face of negativity, for all of us, self-pity is easy and attractive because temporarily it's an ego boost. Oh, woe is me. Everyone else is so mean, yada, yada, yada. But long term, choosing growth and agency is far healthier. Number 3, call out your mind reading habit. A lot of taking things personally is based on a very subtle but powerful cognitive distortion called mind reading. Mind reading means assuming that you know what other people are thinking or feeling. Now, in all fairness, it's not surprising that a lot of us fall into this problem of mind reading because a lot of the time we actually are pretty good at reading people's minds. Just a couple of examples. Suppose you make a sarcastic comment to your husband. Immediately, he furrows his brows, his eyes kind of squint, shoulders tense a little bit. You can see his hands are kind of clenched. And you think to yourself, yikes, he looks really angry. Well, more than likely, you have correctly inferred something about his state of mind. He's angry. You have successfully read his mind. Or let's say you're giving a talk to a small group of people at work maybe, and you kind of look up from your slides and you look around at the audience and you realize many of the people in the audience have this kind of glazed, vacant, faraway look in their eyes. And actually none of them are looking at you. In fact, 2 of them almost look like they're nodding off. So you think to yourself, they really look bored. Probably not a terrible guess. You are correctly inferring something about what's going on between their ears. But here's the thing, just because we are often good at reading other people's minds doesn't mean we always are. In fact, precisely because we're so good at mind reading, it's an especially easy trap to fall into and to assume that we are in every situation. This is a foundation. It's an absolute setup for taking things personally. It's one of the biggest vulnerabilities to falling into this bad habit of taking things personally. So for example, let's say your coworker looks really distracted. So you assume it's because they're bored by your presentation and think you're dumb. But in reality, they just had a huge fight with their spouse earlier in the morning, and they are kind of lost in their own worries about that dilemma. Or let's say your wife looks really irritated and upset. So you assume you're reading her mind, and you assume that she's mad at you. Turns out though, she is irritated, but it has nothing to do with you. So while your mind reading was maybe half right, because you did correctly infer that she was angry or irritated, you completely missed the implication of that emotion. The big takeaway here is go ahead and mind read, just don't assume that you're correct. When you notice yourself taking something personally, ask yourself if you were mind reading. And if so, ask yourself again, in what ways might I have misinterpreted what the other person was thinking or feeling? Maybe they're mad at me, but maybe they're mad at someone else. It's possible they think I'm an idiot, but maybe they just disagreed about the conclusion I came to. I suppose they could have canceled our coffee date because, secretly they resent me and don't want to be friends with me anymore. Or maybe they did, in fact, have a really exhausting day and just need a little bit of time to rest. Number 4, identify and anticipate your triggers. One of the most important but least well understood reasons that people get stuck in this habit of taking things too personally is surprise. Now, surprise is an emotional amplifier. It's an emotion in its own right, but it tends to amplify other emotions that it comes in contact with. So if you feel surprised by feeling anxious, you're probably going to feel a lot more anxious. If you get surprised by feeling happy or joyful, you're probably going to feel a lot more happy and joyful. And if you get surprised by the emotions that go along with taking things too personally, guilt, shame, anger, stuff like that, you're likely to feel even more of those difficult emotions. The implication here is that if you can stop getting so surprised or caught off guard by taking things personally, you won't get nearly as upset and you'll be better able to manage that well. Of course, sometimes surprise is just inevitable. We can't control or predict everything, but your tendency to take things personally is probably a lot more predictable than you realize. So I want you to try something. For a few weeks, keep a little list. It could be a page in a physical notebook. It could be a digital page in your notes app on your phone. But keep a list of times when you found yourself taking things too personally. Just jot down a sentence or two describing what happened and how you felt. For example, I got feedback from my husband about how much I say like, and I felt angry and ashamed. Really simple, quick. Do this for a few weeks, and you will very quickly start to notice patterns. Certain situations and people predictably are triggers for you taking things personally. Maybe it's a particular sales meeting at work, or car rides with your spouse after a long day, or arguments with your kids. In any case, once you've identified 2 or 3 of these common triggers for taking things personally, you can start to anticipate them, which will actually make them easier to handle. So let's say you realize that a major trigger for you when it comes to taking things personally is this particular monthly meeting at work where you have to report out on your team's progress to the CEO of your company. Because you find this meeting, including your tendency to take things personally, to be really stressful, your natural inclination is to avoid thinking too much about it beforehand. Unfortunately, this avoidance strategy actually makes it more likely that you get caught off guard by criticisms or feedback, and as a result, you are way more likely to take things personally. Alternatively, you could try this. Set a reminder on your phone for the day before this big monthly meeting, or whatever your trigger happens to be. Then, when the reminder goes off, you set aside just a few minutes to reflect on 3 really important questions. What criticisms am I likely to get when this trigger or potentially triggering thing happens? If it does happen, how am I likely to feel in response? What stories will I start telling myself? And then lastly, ideally, how would I like to handle those criticisms instead? The beauty of this is, even if you don't generate amazing answers to any of those questions, the simple act of asking them will reduce the element of surprise in the actual event itself, which will mean you are much less likely to feel upset in response to criticism and feedback. And you're going to be better able to handle that criticism and feedback well instead of taking it personally. So, however you choose to do it, just making a little bit of time to reflect on common triggers for your habit of taking things personally and being willing to anticipate them ahead of time, it's one of the simplest but most powerful ways that I have found to stop taking things personally. Number 5, validate the emotions behind taking things personally. As with so many things in life, taking things personally isn't a struggle because it's intellectually really complex or difficult. It's not rocket science. No, it's difficult because it involves difficult emotions. And most of us have never learned how to manage difficult emotions especially well. So, for instance, when a friend stands you up for, a coffee date, you start taking it personally. It's not because you don't intellectually understand that maybe they have a really good reason and it has nothing to do with you. No, it's that you feel really upset, angry, sad, disappointed. And those emotions, they push you to ruminate, to dwell, to worry about all sorts of worst case scenarios. They don't really like me, our friendship isn't important to them, they're such a jerk, all that kind of stuff. And then these unhelpful stories and bits of negative self-talk, these lead to even more difficult emotions, and the vicious cycle spirals out of control. But if you could manage that emotional reaction better, that initial emotional reaction, you could very likely avoid the entire taking things personally cycle and all the excess emotion that goes along with it. And a very simple way to manage any difficult emotion is to just validate it. Now, emotional validation is really straightforward. All it means is you take a moment to remind yourself that it's okay to feel bad, even if it's uncomfortable. So you might say things to yourself like, it's normal to feel upset when a meeting gets canceled or I get stood up. Or it makes sense that I would feel angry after getting such tough feedback. Or, most people in my shoes would feel really disappointed too after a conversation that was that hard. This simple act of emotional validation, it works because it serves the same function as taking things personally, but in a much healthier way. See, the real reason we engage in unhelpful mental habits, things like taking things too personally, it's that they are a way to temporarily cope with or distract ourselves from a difficult emotion. Almost always, this is what's going on. So, for example, let's say you feel anxious about the status of your relationship after your partner criticizes something you did. You start taking it personally and you get lost in thought patterns like worry and rumination. This happens as a way, actually, to avoid, however temporarily, the raw feeling or the emotion. You go up into your head in order to avoid what you're feeling physically and emotionally. Of course, long term, this only makes things much worse. But in the moment, it is serving a function. It's doing a job. Getting lost in that negative self-talk gets you out of the feeling. But if your first reaction to a difficult emotion is to acknowledge and validate it instead, this signals to your brain that it's safe, and that allows your brain to downregulate. Your whole nervous system will calm down instead of getting more tense and agitated. Consequently, you don't need the habit of taking things personally anymore, and it's much easier to just let go of it. So the next time you find yourself taking things personally, try to hit the pause button. Then, instead of getting lost in whatever that kind of reactive storytelling or negative self-talk is about yourself or the other person or what it all means, just take a moment to acknowledge how you're feeling and to validate those feelings as perfectly normal and understandable, even if they're uncomfortable. All right, if you enjoyed this video, I have a weekly newsletter. It's a free newsletter. It goes out every Monday morning where I share my favorite articles, ideas, tips, and tools for building emotional resilience. I answer reader questions about topics like anxiety or relationships or procrastination or insomnia or depression, all sorts of stuff. And I give simple, straightforward, actionable advice. So if that sounds interesting to you, I will put a link to the newsletter in the notes below and you can check that out. And then the last thing I'll say is, if you found this video helpful, I have another one that I think you'll also really like. It's called 3 Ways to Stop Negative Self-Talk, and you can watch it right here.